Hi, welcome back to part C of week 12-13, our course review and information on the examination. So, this part we're looking at strategic actions. So, the strategic actions section that we're looking at is in fact the strategy formulation. And in this class, in this course this semester, we did business level strategy, competitive rivalry, competitive dynamics, corporate level strategy, international strategy, and cooperative strategy. So they're the 5 things we covered within this section of the course. So let's look at topic 4, competitive rivalry and competitive dynamics. And in our discussion of competitive rivalry and competitive dynamics, we define competitors, we define competitive rivalry, we define competitive behaviour, and we define competitive dynamics. We then described market commonality and resource similarity as the building blocks of competitive dynamics. And we also explained awareness as a motivation and ability as drivers. Awareness, motivation, and ability as drivers of competitive behaviour. We also discussed factors affecting the likelihood of attack and the likelihood of response. Discussed factors affecting the likelihood a competitor will respond and attack. And the competitors' dynamics in slow cycle, standard cycle, and fast cycle markets. This led us to having this summary slide here, which is our model of competitive rivalry. Drivers of competitive behaviour, awareness and motivation, competitor analysis, market commonality and resource similarity, inter-firm rivalry, action and response, the likelihood of attack and response, and the likelihood of attack and response included in likelihood of attack, first mover incentives, organisational size and quality, and the likelihood of response, the type of competitive action, actors' reputation, market dependence, and resource availability, leading us to our outcomes, which were of inter-firm rivalry, which were moderated by the speed, the size, the innovation, and quality, moderated our outcomes, and the outcomes varied by the nature of the market type, fast, standard, or slow. Competitive outcomes, whether you've got a sustained competitive advantage or a temporary competitive advantage, and evolutionary outcomes, things like entrepreneurship, growth-orientated actions, and market power actions. Pardon me for coughing, I've just got a little bit of a cold today. So, in your class, in your Moodle forums and your tutorials, we asked you to find examples of each of those things, and we used examples such as Tesla and the rise and fall of Prius as an example of that model. So you should know all the aspects of that model. In business level strategy, which was our next week, topic 5 in business level strategy, we defined business level strategy. We discussed the relationship between customers and business level strategies, who, what, and how. We explained the differences among business level strategies. We used the 5 forces of competition model to explain how above average returns can be earned through each business level strategy, and we described the risks of using each of the business level strategies. So this gave us a model of business level strategy, and the model of business level strategy varied by the competitive scope, whether you had a broad or narrow focus, a broad target market or a narrow target market, and whether you were concentrating on getting competitive advantage through cost or through uniqueness. Again, I'm showing you summary slides of the models, but you need to know the details of the models, and particularly their relationships between this model, for example, business level strategy, how it relates to value, but also how it relates to protecting or addressing issues within the industry environment. So, our broad target competitive a broad target with a cost source of competitive advantage is called cost leadership. A broad target market looking at uniqueness is a differentiation strategy. A narrow target market is focus differentiated, and with uniqueness, and a narrow target market with cost is called focused leadership. And it's now possible to avoid being stuck in the middle. You risk being stuck in the middle following an integrated cost leadership and differentiation strategy, but we went through some companies that did that. We asked you to find examples of those companies. We asked you to find examples to illustrate how those companies, how different companies followed different strategies. Similarly, we talked about the value chain and how the value chain could contribute to both cost leadership and differentiation. And we extended that by talking about how aspects of business level strategy could address competitive pressures from outside the industry, pressures in the industry environment. And we talked about examples of those as well. In week 6, when we looked about corporate strategy, we distinguished corporate level strategy from business level strategy, because corporate level strategy was about the number of companies that were in the, was about the whole company. While business level strategy might be about components or business units within the company. We used Wesfarmers as an example of that. We used David Jones Holdings as an example of that. David Jones Holdings, which owns, not David Jones Holdings. I should have said Woolworths Holdings, which owns David Jones, owns Country Road Group, and owns Woolworths South Africa, we talked about how they contributed. We defined corporate level strategy and its purpose. We discussed the different levels of diversification. We discussed the 3 primary reasons for diversifying, and we described how firms created value following each of the forms of corporate level diversification. And then particularly that last objective, we rediscussed later when we were talking about organizational structure. So the levels of diversification, when we look at our model of levels of diversification, this was an important model. Single businesses have more than 95% of revenue coming from a single business. A dominant business has between 70 and 95 from a single business. So those 2 categories are low levels of diversification. At moderate level of diversification to high level of diversification, we have related constrained and related linked. Related constrained is when 70% of revenue comes from a dominant business. Related linked is when less than 70% comes from a dominant business, but there's common links between the different businesses. And finally, unrelated or conglomerate version of diversification when less than 70% comes from a dominant business and there are no common links between the different businesses. Value-creating diversification is one form of diversification. You gain value-creating diversification in a situation where more than 30% of the sale volume is outside the dominant business. You gain that through economies of scope, sharing activities or transferring core competencies, market power, blocking competitors through multi-point competition or vertical integration, and financial economies, efficient internal capital allocation and business restructuring. And again, we talked about firms and examples of those and the differences between those type of companies. And when we came back to talk about organizational structure and control, we linked that back as well. We discussed value neutral and value reducing diversification and the concept of agency theory and the risk that arose there from managers following particular diversification strategies. And we came up with a model that gave us the sweet spot between the advantages of diversification and for managers, the advantages of diversification for the corporation. Module 7 on international strategy was a particularly exciting module in Module 7 on international strategy, and I'm not quite sure how I've ended up with too many slides in this next section. We're going to jump over a couple of slides because really the most important thing is the model. In international strategy, we looked at incentives that influence firms to use an international strategy, the benefits from firms. Then we looked at what we focused on was the international business level strategy and 3 international corporate level strategies, and the environmental trends for those international strategy. We spend less time on these other issues about strategic competitiveness, about the 5 modes and the different types of international strategy. But we did think it was important to mention this model, which was about identifying international opportunities, exploring resources and capabilities, using core competencies, leading to strategic competitive outcomes. But our main focus was this section of the model. Our main focus was this section of the model in which we identified the 3 major international strategies and how we focused on those 3 major international strategies. And I highlighted that, in fact, here there's another strategy which is really just an export type strategy in extension. So the need to globally integrate, the need for local responsiveness, are both aspects of international corporate level strategy. They're the things that define our international corporate level strategy, and we came up with a number of international corporate level strategies. That one which was high need for local responsiveness, low need for global integration, which is synergy and cost reduction, was a multi-domestic strategy, adapting your company into individual foci. Global strategy, high need for integration, low need for local responsiveness, and transnational when you're trying to pursue both. And in these slides, I talked about, in that week, we asked you to find examples of firms following those. We came up with some very good examples of firms following those. But we talked about international strategy, multi-domestic strategy, a global strategy, and transnational strategy, and what the advantages of each of those things were. And then in our summary, we talked about the assumptions of multidimension, the assumptions of global, and the assumptions of transnational. And in addition to there being examples, we also asked you to find your own examples and report back in the tutorial and in the Moodle forum about those examples. In Module 8, we talked about cooperative strategy. In Module 8, in our cooperative strategy, we covered the following objectives. We defined corporate strategy and explained why firms use them. Did I say corporate then? I meant to say we defined cooperative strategy and how firms use them. We defined and discussed 3 types of strategic alliance. We named the business level cooperative strategies and described their groups. And we discussed the use of corporate level cooperative strategies in diversified firms. And as part of that process, we also addressed things like strategic alliances, as I've mentioned in Objective 2. We talked about what a strategic alliance was and what a joint venture was. We talked about the differences between a joint venture and an equity strategic alliance and a non-equity strategic alliance. 3 definitions that you probably need to know and probably need to cover. We talked about the different market types and how different type of alliances had different reasons for having particular alliances in different market types, and we gave a range of examples. Then we talked about business level cooperative strategy and the combination of resources and capabilities that you needed to have so that the firm can't create itself, and we drew that back to complementary alliances, vertical and horizontal, gave you some examples: competition response, uncertainty reducing, and competition reduction responses. And we assessed those and when you should use them. Complementary business alliances that had a great probability of sustaining competitive advantage. Alliances used in cost reduction normally achieve parity, and horizontal complementary alliances normally end up with a result of partnerships between often difficult to sustain because the partnerships between the different rivals are different, are unstable. And at corporate level, when we talked about corporate level strategic alliances, we talked about how the alliances could be in 3 forms: franchising, synergistic alliances, which is getting components working together, and diversifying alliances, which is expanding and diversifying your market. Compared with business level strategies, corporate level cooperative strategies are broader in scope. They're more complex and more costly. They can be influenced by opportunistic managerial motives. Some of the opportunistic managerial motives we spoke about when we talked about corporate level diversification, corporate strategy and diversification. They require a lot of time and effort to monitor and sustain. You need a trusting relationship. And finally, they can lead to competitive advantage and value when successful alliance experiences are internalized. So that's our core coverage of the area that we discussed for Section 2 of the course, Strategy Formulation. Now, I can hear in the back of your minds, well, why isn't he telling us what exactly is in the exam? Because what I'm doing here is highlighting the key themes from each week, the key themes from each module, emphasizing that you need to know the detail. But each week there is 2, maybe 3 key themes that you need to understand and understand the relationships on. You should have a good understanding of those things because of the nature of the assignments, the assessments, and the work that you have done regularly on your tutorial examples and your forum posts through the semester. Okay, we'll take a bit of a break now and then we'll come back and we will do part D, which looks at strategy implementation.